preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. My name is Jennifer Junta. I work for the lecture program here at the 92nd Street Y. I'd like to welcome you to the About Women lecture series. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I'd first like to invite you to fill out the audience questionnaire. This is so that we can get an idea of what lecture topics you'd like to see for the future About Women lectures. I'd like to tell you about a few of the programs coming up in our lecture series. This Thursday, April 16th, Susan Sontag will be interviewed by Vanity Fair editor Robert Walsh. On Sunday the 26th, Larry King will be here, and on Sunday, May 3rd, we'll have John Bradshaw. On Sunday, May 10th, Susan Faludi, the author of Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women, will be here with Playboy columnist Asa Baber. They're going to discuss male-female relationships. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Judith Plaskow, is a native of Brooklyn, New York, and graduated from Clark University. She earned her PhD at Yale, and her dissertation, Sex, Sin, and Grace, Women's Experience and the Theologies of Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, has become a feminist theological classic. She's now a professor of religious studies at Manhattan College. For 2 years, Dr. Plaskow was co-chair of the Women in Religion group of the American Academy of Religion. With Carol P. Christ, she co-edited the anthologies Woman's Spirit Rising and Weaving the Visions, New Patterns in Feminist Spirituality. Dr. Plaskow is also the co-founder and co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, now in its 8th year of publication. Her new book, Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from a Feminist Perspective, brings 20 years of feminist theological reflection to bear on the transformation of Judaism. The book will be on sale in the lobby following the lecture at a special discount rate. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Judith Plaskow.
I don't think I've ever spoken where I couldn't see people. This feels very strange. It's difficult to think of a topic that more effectively captures the contradictions in Jewish women's situation than women and the Seder. On the one hand, it's women's invisible hours, in some cases days and weeks, that make the Seder possible. It's she who's responsible for the thorough spring cleaning, for searching every corner of the house for chametz, for koshering the stove, for cleaning out the refrigerator, for finding the perfect matzah ball recipe, etc. Yet on the other hand, when it comes to the Seder itself, not only are women traditionally excluded from leading, but their continued responsibilities for the meal often prevent their full participation in the Seder. The mother in the family, and often her female helpers, must constantly be jumping up and down, checking the flame under the chicken soup, making sure that the roast isn't getting overdone, or doing various other chores in the kitchen. If she's lucky enough to have help there, it's still rare that she takes the lead in the Seder as she does in the preparation for the Seder. We could thus say that the role of women in the Jewish tradition as enablers is perhaps nowhere clearer than in relation to the Passover Seder. That is to say, without women, the Seder would simply be impossible. And yet, when it comes to participation in the liturgical event at which all this preparation is aiming, women's enabler role keeps her on the sidelines. This issue that Jewish women have for centuries made possible forms of participation from which we ourselves are excluded is in fact the issue that first seized the attention of Jewish feminists 20 years ago. Rachel Adler, in her classic piece, The Jew Who Wasn't There, wrote about how women in the Jewish tradition are socialized as peripheral Jews. The ideal Jewish woman is one who sacrifices herself so that others can achieve spiritual self-realization. Perhaps the finest example of this sacrifice in the tradition is Rabbi Akiva's wife, Rachel, who gives up her family, her money, her hair, the possibility of an intimate marriage relationship to send her husband away to study for 14 years and to give us one of the great rabbis of the tradition. And yet, at the same time that women are supposed to sacrifice ourselves so that others can perform the great commandment to study and to pray, women ourselves are excused or barred from acts that are the heart of the believing community. It's this injustice that led to the feminist demand for equal access. If women are going to prepare the Seder, then it seems only a matter of simple justice that women should sit and enjoy the Seder. If women are going to lead in the labor, then women should also get to lead in the liturgy. Now, I think that there's another side to this issue of equal access that the Seder also makes very clear. The creation of an egalitarian Judaism is not simply a matter of women's taking on men's roles, of women being able to lead the Seder and other liturgical events, but also men taking on what have traditionally been defined as women's roles. For those who would argue that cleaning the house for Passover, that ridding it of hametz is an important part of the spiritual meaning of Passover, I would say, terrific. Why should women have a lock on the spiritual value of cleaning an oven? Why should only women have the satisfaction of making matzah balls that are just as good as the ones that grandmother used to make? The reality is that there simply isn't the time to cook and to clean and to prepare for the Seder celebration, and also do a good job in thinking over how one wants to lead the Seder and prepare for the liturgical part of the evening. A woman who wants equal participation in men's roles without expecting men to share in women's roles is taking on a double burden. The double burden with which we're familiar in the wider society when women go out and begin to work and yet are still expected to do all the tasks that they've always done at home. So I think that here again, we can extrapolate from the problems that women confront in relation to Passover to other areas of Jewish life. The larger project of women's participation in Jewish religion and Jewish communal life presupposes a thorough redistribution of roles in the Jewish community. If women with children, for example, are to participate in communal prayer, then there needs to be a redistribution of childcare responsibilities in the family and the assumption of childcare responsibilities on the part of the community. If women are going to sit on committees in their synagogues and in their Jewish institutions, then these committees are going to have to stop meeting at dinner time. If women are going to work for Jewish institutions, then there will have to be a daycare center at every Jewish institution in the country. So it's fairly easy to move from the Seder to the larger agenda of Jewish feminism to change Jewish life in a more egalitarian direction. There's another issue, however, that the Seder raises that is in fact the issue I would like to focus on this evening. Beyond the issue of sex role division, there is also the content of the Seder. There are, after all, many households, one would hope an increasing number of households in this country, in which men share in the cleaning for Passover and women share in the leading of the Seder. But in a sense, it's precisely as we rectify the most blatant injustices that have always marked the observance of Passover that we're able to notice and attend for the first time to the larger invisibility of women in the Passover service. Where are women in the Haggadah? Now, in addressing this question, we have to begin by acknowledging that Moses himself is not mentioned in the Haggadah or is mentioned only once very briefly. The drama of Passover is not a human drama, but a divine drama, a drama of the divine liberation of the Jewish people. But somehow this doesn't mean that there's a dearth of men in the Haggadah. I went through my traditional Haggadah as I was thinking about this evening, and I discovered that, to begin with, there's the bread of poverty that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. There's Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon, who, without their wives, talked all night about the Passover service until it was time to say the morning prayers. Were the women in their lives entering and leaving silently throughout this whole discussion, putting dishes of food before them on the table? Or were the women perhaps at home trying to sleep, fearful that the Romans might be knocking on their door? Then there are the 4 sons, or in more enlightened recent Haggadahs, the 4 children. Then there's Laban the Aramean, who sought to uproot Jacob, our father. Then there's Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, Rabbi Eliezer, and Akiva, who vie with each other over magnifying the number of plagues and thus the number of miracles performed in Egypt and at the Red Sea. There's Rabbi Gamaliel, who tells us to describe the central symbols of Passover, without which we have not done our duty. And of course, there's our favorite Hillel sandwich of matzah and maror. I'm sure I'm leaving some out, but that's a good beginning. And hovering behind all these men is the Holy One, blessed be He, who with a mighty hand and outstretched arm and with great terribleness and with signs and with wonders brought us out from there. At this point, Esther Broner's new 4 daughters ask some terribly pertinent questions. Mother, asks the clever daughter, who are our mothers? Who are our ancestors? What is our history? Give us our name or genealogy. Mother, asks the wicked daughter, if I learn my history, will I not be angry? Will I not be bitter as Miriam, who was deprived of her prophecy? Mother, asks the simple daughter, if Miriam lies buried in sand, why must we dig up those bones? Why must we remove her from sun and stone where she belongs? The one who knows not how to question, she has no past, she can have no present, she can have no future, without knowing her mother, without knowing her angers, without knowing her questions. The topic of women and the Seder, then, points us not simply to issues of equal access for women, but to the necessity for a transformational model of Jewish feminism. It's necessary, but it's not enough that men should share the preparation for Passover and for the Seder meal, and that women should be able to participate fully and to lead the Seder. We also have to reshape the content of Passover and of the tradition to reflect women's presence. Now, this process of transformation is already underway and touches every aspect of Jewish life. I would like to use the Seder to discuss the feminist transformation of three major aspects of Judaism: Torah, new rituals, and Jewish liturgy. These issues go far beyond the Seder, yet in each case, the Seder illustrates them magnificently. First of all, women are transforming Torah within Judaism. Torah is an extremely rich and fluid term. It refers to everything from the 5 books of Moses to all of Jewish teaching and learning. However we define Torah, however, the paradigm of the male-centeredness of Judaism lies at its very center in the moment of God's descent onto Sinai. At the moment that the entire Jewish people stands at the foot of Sinai, ready to enter into the covenant, Moses turns to the people and says, "Be ready on the 3rd day, do not go near a woman." That is, at the central moment of Jewish history, the Jewish community is addressed as a community of men. What this means to me is that the invisibility of women that we see in the Haggadah extends backwards in time to the first moment when God says to Abraham, "Lech lecha, get up and go to a new land that I will tell you about," and forward to the revelation at Sinai, and beyond that to all the normative texts of the Jewish tradition. Now, we could dismiss women's invisibility in the Haggadah and in other Jewish sources as the product of an earlier era and attend to what is in itself a very difficult task, the task of achieving women's rights within the Jewish present. But the Seder alerts us to the danger of this approach, the danger of forgetting about the past to focus on the present. Passover, of all the holidays in the Jewish year, affirms the profound connection between the Jewish past and present. In the climactic words of the Seder, we read, "It was not only our fathers sick, that the Holy One, blessed be He, redeemed, but us as well did He redeem along with them." If we cannot find ourselves in this redemption, this central moment of our history, what can our role be in the community today? Like the wicked child, we will find ourselves on the margins, not through our own wickedness, however, but because the tradition places us there. Fortunately, it isn't all that difficult to place women at the center of this story of redemption, for the story of Passover is filled with wonderful women. The Midrash tells us that when the Israelites came to the Red Sea, the sea did not part until the first Jew had the courage to step into the sea and step up until the waters came to his chin. Preceding his courage, however, was the courage of Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives who violated Pharaoh's decree to kill all male children at the moment of their birth, and who lied to Pharaoh in order to save their people. Shiphrah and Puah are the first agents in the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt. They are models of the conscientious objector who acts against the law and in solidarity with her people. The courage of Shiphrah and Puah is followed by the courage of Moses' mother, who again, in defiance of Pharaoh's decree, saves her child in a basket and floats him down the Nile. Also part of the Passover narrative in the Tanakh, if not in the Haggadah, is Miriam, one of the most intriguing women figures in the Bible. Miriam first appears without any kind of introduction, as if we all knew who she was from long ago, in relation to the foundational event of Jewish history, the crossing of the Red Sea. With Aaron, she is involved in a challenge to Moses' leadership in the desert. Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Miriam and Aaron ask their brother. And Miriam, again, along with Moses and Aaron, is one of only 3 wilderness leaders whose deaths are recorded in the Tanakh. And yet Miriam is clearly a much more important figure in Jewish history than the number of texts about her would imply. When she and Aaron challenge Moses' leadership, it's Miriam who's punished with leprosy and not her brother. Miriam is called a prophetess in the text, and Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took her timbrel and led the women in dance, but we don't know what her prophecy was. It's almost as if the text was edited to deliberately shrink her, to make her seem less important than she was in the actual history of her people. We're not left, however, with these tantalizing hints of a historical Miriam, because Midrash provides us with a way to fill in the gaps in the biblical text. When the rabbis had questions about the Bible, or when they perceived gaps in a biblical story, they didn't rest with the silences that they found there. They brought their own questions to the text, and they had the courage to answer them. They created Midrash and wrote the text forward. The rabbis themselves asked many questions about Miriam. They wanted to know why she was called a prophetess when we didn't have her prophecy. And they said that she prophesied the birth of her brother, that she predicted to her parents that her mother would bear the Savior of Israel. The rabbis asked, why did Miriam rebuke Moses in the wilderness? And they answered, she rebuked him because he stopped having sexual relations with his wife after he received revelation, because he wanted to be ready at any moment to receive the presence of God, and he couldn't do that if he was having sex with his wife. That reflects back on that, be ready on the 3rd day, do not go near a woman. Well, Moses wanted to be ready every day, says the Midrash. Well, in poetry and prose, feminists have begun to create our own Miriams, mirroring our own experience and mirroring the many faces of women within the tradition. Muriel Rukeyser's Miriam stands on the shores of the sea singing. My unseen brothers, she says, have gone over, chariots deep seas under. I alone stand here ankle deep, and I sing, until the lands sing to each other. Chris Canaday's Miriam is a bitter Miriam, rebelling against her punishment. Help. thorns of the flesh, leprosy scabs bloom on my arms, hands, and face. My hair is thinner. God has punished me unfairly, judged me unmercifully. Now for 7 days I will be separated, claimed unclean, not fit to sit inside the camp, scorned like a diseased slave, an Egyptian harlot. Once a songgiver, a maiden of God, a chaste reed for his breath, I dared be like a man, a prophet, dared speak against my brother, dared speak against Moses, dared become more than a forgotten flute, a broken harp. Haber-Weisla's Miriam is a haggard old maid. I stood there at Sinai next to Miriam, she says. Now there was a hard-bitten career woman, if I've ever seen one. Tall, gaunt, and bony, with a shock of frizzy black hair, a hawk nose, and haunted eyes. The gossip about her in the camp was nasty. Haggard old maid, no wonder she thinks she sees God. I hear she has quite a thing for Caleb ben Jephunneh, but he won't give her a second look. You'd think with all her brother's influence he could prevail on him to take her. She looked just the person to dicker with Pharaoh's daughter about a nursemaid's hire, but I couldn't believe she had ever taught Aaron to dance. I never saw her smile. And then there's Haber-Rome's Miriam, who argues for her place as prophetess, and in doing so, names the other women of the Exodus narrative. And since this is my own personal favorite, I want to read this whole poem. That morning when we left you in the bulrushes, scrubbed clean and freshly swaddled in your simple basket, I knew you were too precious to abandon. And when the young princess was taken by your innocence and claimed you for her own, it was no mere fate that restored you to the full breasts of your rightful mother, but your sister's cunning. You lived a stranger in the house of the oppressor. I grew up among midwives, stubborn tribeswomen, who spared the newborn sons in rank defiance of the Pharaoh's orders. You learned to speak for us before kings and officials. I coaxed children from the narrows into light with singing, tempered by our kin, laboring long in huts and brickyards. My brother, we have both been chosen. What you witness on the mountain cannot live without the miracles below. Women, draw water for the journey. I have packed the bells and timbrels. Let us go. Second, women are transforming Jewish ritual. The invisibility of women in the Haggadah represents not simply women's absence from Torah, but also the absence of women from Jewish ceremony. It's astonishing in a tradition with so many blessings and rituals. Blessings for eating the first watermelon of the season, for seeing the rainbow, for seeing a friend who you haven't seen for a long time, has no blessings and rituals to mark the central biological events of women's lives. Moreover, so many rituals and ceremonies in the tradition, like the Passover Seder, depict the Jewish community as a male community. Because of this absence of women from Jewish blessings and ceremonies, new rituals have been a key area for feminist inventiveness. Feminists have sought to create ceremonies where none exist. Ceremonies for welcoming a daughter into the covenant, for a girl's first menstrual period, for the gaining of wisdom and achieving old age, commitment ceremonies between women, and so on. Women have also tried to transform traditional rituals. And here I think there is no better example than the Passover Seder. It's almost as if the celebration of our people's freedom kindles a yearning for liberation in us as women, a yearning for liberation that has found expression in a whole variety of ways. Perhaps the easiest way to begin transforming the Haggadah is to add material on women to the existing liturgy. Since our sages tell us that to dwell at length on the story of our liberation is indeed praiseworthy, there is ample warrant for bringing new issues, new materials, new traditions into the Seder. After all, in the last couple of decades, American Jews have found ourselves adding to the Seder materials on Soviet Jewry, materials on the Holocaust, materials on the Middle East. Now there is also an increasing store of materials on women. In my family, or some of my family Seders, depending on which piece of the family is doing the hosting, we put a variety of Haggadahs on the table, or we assign people to come prepared with their favorite piece of liturgy that they would like to add to the brew. Then, along with, or instead of, the 4 sons, we can read Esther Broner's 4 daughters that I read to you a few moments ago. 1 or more cups of wine can be dedicated to one of the women of the Jewish tradition or of the Passover story. And in conjunction with dedicating the cup of wine, we might read a poem, such as one of the Miriam poems that I just shared with you. Esther Broner and Naomi Nimrod's Women's Haggadah, Stolen Legacy, contributes a new dayenu that can be added to any Passover meal. If Chava had been created in the image of God and not as a helper to Adam, it would have sufficed. If she had been created as Adam's equal and not been considered a temptress, it would have sufficed. If she were the first woman to eat from the tree of knowledge and had been recognized as bringing knowledge to us, dayenu. If Lot's wife had been honored for compassion in looking back at the fate of her family in Sodom and not been punished for it, dayenu. If our mothers had been honored for their daughters as well as for their sons, dayenu. If Miriam were given her seat with Moshe and Aaron in our legacy, dayenu. If women had been among the writers of the Tanakh and had interpreted our creation and our role in history, dayenu. If women had written the Haggadah and placed our mothers where they belong in history, dayenu. At the same time that some of us are taking the perhaps timid step of adding women's material to our family seders, there are many groups of friends, many college communities, and many local communities that have developed traditions of a women's Seder. Sometimes this women's Seder takes place one of the first 2 nights of Passover, and sometimes it's a 3rd Seder held either before or during the holiday. Many Haggadot have been created for these women's Seders, and it seems to me that they basically represent 2 rather different directions. Some of these women's Haggadahs, like the one that Aviva Cantor has been handing out flyers for at the door, try to integrate material on women's history and struggle with the material of the traditional Haggadah, so that it would be possible to use this Haggadah as the central Passover Haggadah and to deal with issues of women's struggle and of Jewish liberation at the same time. In these Haggadot, one might ask the traditional 4 questions, for example, and answer them in the traditional way, and yet expand on that answer or those answers in ways that include women. to give you an example from Judith Stein's Jewish Lesbian Seder, why do we dip the greens twice tonight? Avadot hayinu, we were slaves. The first time we dipped our greens in salt water to taste the tears of enslavement. But this also reminds us of life and growth, of earth and sea, which give us sustenance. The second time we dipped the maror into the haroset to remind ourselves of the mortar our ancestors mixed as slaves to build monuments for the pharaohs of Egypt. The haroset is sweet as a sign of hope. With it, we remind ourselves that even through the bitterness of slavery, our foremothers were able to sustain themselves with the vision of freedom. So too do we live and grow in the midst of oppression, fueled by the vision of our lives as free women. Why do we recline when we eat? Avadot hayinu, we were slaves. Reclining at the table was the sign of freedom in ancient times. Since our ancestors were freed from bondage, on this night we recline to remind ourselves that, like our ancestors, we can overcome bondage and slavery. As lesbians together, we recline in the recognition of shared work and responsibility. No one woman is slaving in the kitchen to prepare our meal, while others sit back and enjoy it. As lesbians, we prepared this Seder for each other to share ourselves and our culture. In telling the story of the Exodus, such Haggadahs may tell the traditional story, including women and expanding midrashically on women's role. Thus, from the Oberlin Haggadah, we get what begins as the traditional midrash. So Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every boy that is born shall be thrown into the Nile, but let every girl live." We cried unto Adonai, the God of our ancestors, and Adonai heeded our plight, our misery, and our oppression. Our misery, this refers to the children. Our legends tell us that Pharaoh tried to get the Jews to collaborate in murdering their own people. Pharaoh ordered the two-head midwives, Shifra and Puah, to kill newborn males at birth and to report the birth of Jewish females so that they could be raised as prostitutes for his court. But the midwives were the first among the Israelites to resist their oppression. They refused to carry out Pharaoh's command. Instead, they took special care of the women and their infants. When Pharaoh asked them to account for all the living children, they made up the story that Jewish women gave birth too quickly before the midwives could arrive. Other women's Haggadahs make women's liberation the central subject of the Seder. They use the structure of the traditional Seder as a format for forefronting and celebrating women's struggles within the Jewish tradition. Thus, the four questions of the Nimrod and Brona Haggadah, Stolen Legacy, are clearly very different from the four questions of the traditional Haggadah. Why is this Haggadah different from traditional Haggadot? Because this Haggadah deals with the exodus of women. Why have our mothers on this night been bitter? Because they did the preparation, but not the ritual. They did the serving, but not the conducting. They read of their fathers, but not of their mothers. Why on this night do we dip twice? Because of the natural and unnatural cycles of blood. Why on this night do we recline? We recline on this night for the unhurried telling of the legacy of Miriam. Third, women are transforming Jewish liturgy. The subject of new ritual spills necessarily into the question of liturgical transformation, and in particular, the transformation of images of God. The insistently male God of Jewish liturgy, and perhaps especially of the Haggadah, the King, the Lord, the Holy One, blessed be He with His mighty hand and outstretched arm, have become for many women a real stumbling block to prayer. The male image of God has become an idol, and many women experience ourselves as worshiping maleness rather than as worshiping God. Some of the new Haggadot that I have mentioned and others that I have not mentioned offer then not only new images of women's participation in Jewish history, but also new images of God. The male God of the traditional Haggadah becomes the female God of the new feminist Haggadah. Adonai becomes Shekhinah. King becomes queen. The king of the universe becomes the compassionate giver of life, the life of worlds. In this same spirit, Maggie Wenig and Naomi Janowitz have transformed Miriam's song at the sea in order to make the image of God in the song a female image. She writes, "I will sing my praise to the Lord. To her alone I will sing praise. The Lord is my mother, my strength. I will exalt her all my days. For she subdued the waves with her might and softened the sands with her touch. Her arm rescued the enslaved, and her voice comforted our people in their despair. Women, gather timbrels, cymbals, and flutes. Make heard the glory of the Lord. Wear your colors, ribbons, bells, and gold to honor the victory of our God. Come barefooted, dance on the shore, send forth a song, sing hallelujah, sing praise to the Lord, to her alone sing your praise. For the horizons cannot restrain her power, nor the heavens contain her radiance. Her children cannot tire her understanding, and her womb is deep and broad." Such images provide a different affirmation of women's power from the images of powerful women in our historical tradition. They tell us not only have women been active in Jewish history, but we might dare to imagine the ultimate power in the universe as female and ourselves as in its image. Let us reflect further for a moment on these female images, however. If we change the God of the Passover Haggadah in this way, is it enough? On the one side, do we want the hand that drowns Egyptians in the sea to be a female hand? And on the other hand, if we picture the female God as a compassionate God, a God of deep and broad womb, have we simply taken the stereotypical images of women in our culture and reified them, projected them onto the universe? Who, after all, is the God of the Haggadah? A God for whom politics and religion are never separate? A God who lures us to liberation when very often we would just as soon stay back in Egypt where we are? A God who wants to free us, but who can't do it without help? The help of the midwives, the help of Miriam, the help of Moses, the help of the Israelite who had the courage to step into the sea before it parted. A God who for some reason cannot liberate Israelites without drowning Egyptians, and who reminds us then that for the oppressed to be liberated, the oppressor must surrender power or be made to surrender power, whatever that means. A God who reminds us that liberation is messy, and that the liberation of some is often achieved at the expense of others. A God who invites us to reflect on our own liberation and its relationship to the sacred in this season. The topic of women and the Seder, then, brings together many different themes. It starts us off on the relatively clear subject of the marginalization of women in Judaism. It represents perhaps the archetypal example of the relegation of women to the role of enabler. The Seder reminds us, and it reminds us year after year as we watch our mothers getting up and going into the kitchen, of the necessity for a thorough rethinking of gender roles in the tradition in both our personal, family, and communal relationships. But the topic, women and the Seder, also brings us face to face with the silence and invisibility of women in the content of the tradition. It calls on us to begin to speak into silences, and it reminds us of the real processes of transformation that have already begun within Judaism. Let me conclude then with another Miriam poem that I think expresses the place where we find ourselves as women in celebrating Passover this year. This poem by Ruth Sohn is called, "I Shall Sing to the Lord a New Song." I, Miriam, stand at the sea and turn to face the desert, stretching endless and still. My eyes are dazzled, the sky brilliant blue, sunburnt sands unyielding white. My hands turn to dove wings, my arms reach for the sky, and I want to sing the song rising inside me. My mouth open, I stop. Where are the words? Where the melody? If in a moment of panic my eyes go blind, can I take a step without knowing a destination? Will I falter? Will I fall? Will the ground sink away from under me? The song still unformed, how can I sing? To take the first step, to sing a new song, is to close one's eyes and dive into unknown waters. For a moment, knowing nothing, risking all. But then to discover the waters are friendly, the ground is firm, and the song rises again. Out of my mouth come words lifting the wind, and I hear for the first time the song that has been in my heart, silent, unknown, even to me. Hag Sameach. I will be happy to entertain questions, comments, discussion, whatever. Yeah, in the back.
You might get a question that starts out with the usual format of complimenting you on the tremendous job that you did, but then saying, guess what?
Mm-hmm.
The guess what is that as I was listening to this, and my heart was singing and the things you were saying, and I kept saying, yes, I agree, right on. As I'm listening to this, I'm thinking to myself, who needs it? You know, I really want to say I want to take this whole religion, this whole Judaism, and maybe if I was born a Catholic, I'd say the same. If I was born a Buddhist, I'd say the same. I take the whole darn thing and
respond? I wouldn't argue with you at all until you get to the moment where you say the tradition did nothing but diminish us and degrade us. I would not stand up here and argue with someone who feels as you do that you should stay in or should do these things. There are many exciting and wonderful things for women happening outside the framework of traditional religion. And I think the question of whether one chooses to stay inside or outside is a very personal question that finally is not decided on rational grounds. When I sit every year at the Seder and I begin to add these things and to talk about women's history and to share the experience and the dilemmas of liberation and the dilemma that, my people's liberation meant the death of another people, and how do I deal with that, and what does it mean, and what does it mean to go forth from freedom, and what does it mean to be in the wilderness? I find that these are questions that are immensely moving and real to me, and that the Jewish tradition gives me a framework within which to articulate them, and therefore, I'm not willing to hand over the tradition to them. I'm just as much a Jew as the people who have excluded me and degraded me, and therefore I am going to make it my tradition because I still find it meaningful. But I would not argue with somebody who feels that the oppression is much stronger than that experience of connection, because, intellectually I could argue that position also. I think that my connection with the tradition is finally an emotional one, and the question that I ask is, what does a feminist who feels that connection do to make the tradition hers, to wrench from it, her equality and participation?
Mine is a very logistical question. I think I'm lucky enough to have only been born with sisters, and so by definition have always taken part in the Seder. My question is, you must end up with a loose leaf binder of a Haggadah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, for sure.
Now, when you say leave the Seder,
well, that's why I said that it's really important that everybody in the family take part in preparing the meal and cleaning the house, because to lead a loose leaf Seder takes a lot of preparation. You don't just open up the old Manischewitz Haggadah and start at page 1 and go through to the end. I think it is very much that situation. As I've said, in my family, we might have a dozen Haggadahs on the table and say to people, these are coming at the story of Passover from many different perspectives. Take a look at them, and when you find something that you find really speaks to you and is important for us all to hear, bring it to our attention and insert it into the Seder. So we have a kind of loose leaf Haggadah that everyone has in common. And then we also pause whenever anybody wants to add to bring new things into the Seder. And when those things really work and lead to good discussion, then we can add them to the loose leaf for the next year as part of the foundation of what we do.
the second part of the question is, how old are the kids? I mean, to pull something like that off.
We have done this with very young children and kids. Last year, for example, we had kids at our Seder who were, well, they were 5 and 8. But they came from homes where they'd never sat through a Seder, that was more than 15 minutes, and ours was 2 hours. And they were talking about it for weeks afterward, because the fact that people were lively and participating and discussing real issues in their lives, and that they could come in and say how they felt about those questions, brought them in a way that I wouldn't have expected. I must say that we also do certain things for the kids. Again, a couple of years ago, friends of ours who were invited to the Seder came bringing a very mysterious brown bag with them. And when we came to the 10 plagues and we said frogs, all of a sudden there were little frogs, rubber frogs. And the same thing for gnats and, cattle disease. There were little cattle. And that was wonderful in getting the attention of the kids and, bringing them in the middle of what was a lot of talk and additions. So that was an innovation that we decided to keep. We gathered up all the frogs and put them in with the Haggadahs for the next year.
Thank you. I really, every time I hear you, appreciate the depth and the volume of the research that you've done. I wanted to say something about the Haggadah. During different times during the year, I leave a different one in the afternoon for a week or two, or send a different one on the train with my husband when he's
So that you're studying new resources throughout the year. Yeah, that's a very nice idea.
Not always the day before the Seder.
Right.
I also a technical question. I'm reporting back for a couple of dozen women for Rosh Chodesh groups, and I'm not sure I got all the references right. I wonder if you published anything about this, or if we can write you for the bibliography of the poets that you quoted some of them.
Yeah, you can write to me I haven't written anything about this, but you can actually, in my book, Standing Again at Sinai, I cite some of the, although I don't quote the poems at length, I do cite some of the poets that I read from tonight, so they're there in the footnotes. But you can also, write to me for the names of them. I mean, one of the very sad things about the situation with the many Haggadot that there are now is that virtually none of them are published. So that unless you know somebody who's part of the Oberlin community or the Denver community or this community, that you don't have access to the very rich resources that are out there. And I think that a very exciting publication project for some Rosh Chodesh group would be to gather the various unpublished women's Haggadahs that are around and put down all the different versions of the 4 children under the 4 children, all the different versions of the 4 questions. I mean, that could really be a very exciting and important project. Oh yeah, there really are. I mean, there are many.
Just getting back to the first question, even if you take the attitude that you feel that there's some home for you in the tradition of Judaism and that you don't want to just junk the whole thing, I listen to you and I say, yes, you're right, I follow along. Then I get to thinking that I sort of look around the room and, the vast majority of people here are women. And,
it's because the men are home cleaning the house for Passover.
But, even apart from the really Orthodox, who will never even, give a second glance to the kind of thing you're talking about, there's still, an awful lot of reform conservative communities and families and men that also would not be interested. So I just wonder, do you see any hope for a real transformation? It almost makes you want to check the whole thing when you realize that the good progress is, even if you feel like you want to retain some of the tradition.
Well, the answer is sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, and it depends what I'm looking at. I do believe that we have the power to create local communities that can fulfill our Jewish needs by finding people who share those needs. And that if you find a local community that can help you to live the kind of Judaism that you want to see in the future, then you begin to believe that it's possible. Even if the larger Jewish community out there seems very far from those kinds of changes. Sometimes when I look at the larger community, I feel, oh, this is hopeless. And then I go back to communities that are making change, and I say, no, it isn't. That when you give people new resources, they respond to them. They're excited about them. And, people want to talk about the meaning of Passover. They don't want to mumble their way through the Haggadah. They want to talk about these issues in their own lives. And, even in a fairly conventional family, if you ask people a question that gives them the space to connect what's going on with what's happening in their lives, they'll take it. And they'll like it. They might think you're weird, but they'll also walk out feeling like they did something that year that they hadn't done every other year. And that makes me believe that change is possible, although it will take a very long time.
What do you make of, Orthodox women who are quite happy in their traditional roles? I mean, what's your attitude towards women who are totally unreceptive to the idea that there's a problem?
I don't know. There was a time in my life when I would have said, false consciousness, blah, blah. And I feel less imperialistic, I guess, at this point in my life. And I feel that there is a tremendous amount of change that's happening in the Orthodox community, some of it recognized and some of it unrecognized, that there's going to be more change in the next generation. And, if people are satisfied, it's not my responsibility to make them miserable. But I do think that the fact that girls are being given the same education as boys in more and more yeshivas is really going to open up the same kind of changes in the next generation of Orthodox women that it did for conservative women in my generation when they were given equal education and then told, well, it's your bat mitzvah, goodbye. This is the end of your participation. So I see change coming.
I wonder if you could go further with the discussion of your notion of God. Notion of God, because you left us with an unacceptable vision of male God and a not satisfactory vision of the female God. You then move into something, I'm just trying to imagine, is it a naturalistic nature? Or what do you...
Well, I think that what I would move into is a great diversity of images of God. And the reason that I was sort of inconclusive about that is that I feel that that Jewish feminism is at a very open-ended place on that issue. That, a Haggadah that I myself did 15 years ago, I went through and I changed half of the times that it said he in the Haggadah to she. And when I do that now, it just seems like it doesn't do anything. So what? It's the same Haggadah. So I'm saying she sometimes. What does that mean? And I think that experiment and that move was important and is important, and I want to keep those she's there. But I also want to move to more naturalistic images of God and gender-neutral images of God, and but not totally natural, because I think that the image of historical liberator that is so central to the Haggadah, I would not want to throw that aside. So what I really want to see is a tremendous range of images for God that says to us, first of all, open our imaginations. Let's think about who the God of Passover is, rather than placing a name on him, her. Let that be part of the process of what the Seder is about.
I wonder what you do when you confront someplace in the tradition which you can't maneuver with. It's something that you come up against, and it just doesn't jive with the way you see the world. And that way you either have to, what do you do with it?
I say it's wrong. No, really, no. I mean, I think that there are things in the tradition that I have to say, this is wrong. This is morally wrong. Such as, if a man lies with a man is with a woman, he shall be stoned to death. There's nothing to do with that. Except to use it, Rebecca Alpert in her Peace and Twice Blessed says that every year, when we get to that place in the Torah portion, every synagogue in the country should have Gay Awareness Week, and should bring in people to begin to talk about gay and lesbian Jews in the Jewish community and Jewish history. So I think that when we come to those places, we can't just snip them out and throw them away, because we have to acknowledge the ways in which we've been formed by them. But I think that we can do that in ways that help us to move past and to say we cannot be here anymore. We have to deal with this and move beyond it. And I think there are those places where, there isn't any way to interpret. It's just wrong, and that's it. Exterminate Amalek, I would say that's another one. What do we do with that?
How do you personally deal with the gender issue of God naming in Hebrew? Like we have in Kodesh Baruch Hu, it's translated as Blessed Holy One, but it's still in Kodesh Baruch Hu.
Well, a number of the Haggadahs that I was looking at do change the Hebrew. They say Baruch at Shekhinah rather than Baruch atah Adonai. Or some use Elah. Now that's very controversial because that is the term for goddess in the Bible. But a number of these Haggadahs do retranslate the Hebrew as well as the English. If you take a look at Or Hadash, which is the Pnei Or prayer book, it has every blessing in the prayer book in both male and female language. And you can take your choice for any particular blessing. And that's quite usable in terms of translating the blessings and language of the Haggadah. So there have been a number of efforts to translate the Hebrew also. I think Shekhinah probably being the most popular. Or the New Reconstructionist prayer book uses Yah rather than Adonai as a more naturalistic, and Yah as breath, and therefore is a more neutral term. That's another one that I've seen.
I was going to say something about the Reconstructionist liturgy has been a lot more congenial.
Yes.
You mentioned the other three. But I wanted to ask another question about the Parsha or Shira. 2 weeks ago, a couple months ago, I guess. That we had an interesting discussion about Miriam taking delight and exulting in the death of the Egyptians in the sea. I've always had trouble with that. I wanted to know if you could say something.
Yeah, I find that whole question, as I've suggested, of the liberation of the Israelites involving the deaths of the Egyptians, a very difficult and painful and challenging question. And on the one hand, I do find it difficult, but it's not one of those places in the tradition where I can just say this is wrong, because it's a process that's enacted over and over again, that as new groups come into power, then those who oppress them have to relinquish power. And what if the oppressor won't relinquish power? I was watching a film on the civil rights movement last week in which someone said, a rattlesnake doesn't up and drop dead. And I think that's a moment in the story of our liberation that we really need to look at in terms of what are the concrete processes of liberation in our lives, and who gets hurt, who dies, really or metaphorically, as other people are liberated, and can we imagine a liberation that does not involve the deaths of others?
Well, not so much the death, but do we want to teach exaltation in our oppressors who were not rattlesnakes? They were people. I mean, can we say that we were glad when Hitler died? I mean, maybe this was the example?
Isn't that answered by God? Isn't that answered by God saying, "Why are you rejoicing?"
Yes, right. We spill the drops of wine in order not to rejoice fully. And yet, at the other hand, if you imagine the Israelites being pursued by the Egyptians to the shores of the sea, I'm sure they were ecstatic when they drowned. And what do we do with that reality?
They didn't tell the ending of the story every year. They didn't.
Right. Okay, maybe we should stop at this point and we can continue in private conversation if people wish.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.